Hello, everybody. We do have attendees coming in right now. My name is Luke Fry. I'm the Associate Director of Communication for BBB serving Connecticut. And welcome to our next rendition of our Building a Better Business webinar series. Just a few housekeeping items. If you would like to download today's slide deck, it is available in your Handouts tab. So if you've joined on your computer, you can go to the Handouts tab and download today's slide deck. Also, if you have a question, please type it in the questions box over on your tabs as well. So again, if you have any questions, please type all of your questions in the questions box, and we will try to get to all of those after the presentation. So today's topic, I believe every business owner in the world right now is thinking about. I think after last night's presidential speech about America opening up and the New York's Mayor de Blasio saying that Manhattan is going to be opened up by July 1st has everybody, thinking about how can we get our employees back safely. So today we are joined by Diane Mokriski, who is the HR counsel at CBIA, and she is going to be sharing with us everything Connecticut employers need to know about life and office life past COVID. So Diane, we appreciate you joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Luke. So I'm Diane Mokriski, and I'm an attorney here at CBIA. I've been here since about December of last year, and before I joined CBIA, I was in private practice as an attorney for about 20 years. And so in that role, I represented business owners when they were either sued by employees for a variety of things. It could be discrimination or wage and hour issues or contract issues, or I would advise employers on how to either prevent lawsuits or how to handle employment law issues generally at work. So now I'm here at CBIA, and my job is to, again, guide employers through the new employment laws that are constantly coming up with COVID. And today, specifically, we're going to try and guide all of you through all the things that come into play that have to do with returning to work, because now that businesses are reopening, employees are coming back, and there are a lot of things to keep in mind. And so we're going to separate this into 5 general categories. And the first one is vaccines. And just so you know, so you can kind of plan ahead, we're going to talk about vaccines and masks and quarantining and sick leave. And the 5th category is just kind of returning to the work site in general. And so each of those 5 categories have a lot of things intermixed, and so we'll talk about each one and how that applies to employees coming back to work. So the first thing, vaccinations, is a very hot topic, and everyone's got a million questions about that. And so one thing I'd like people to just keep in mind, first and foremost, is that there's a difference between what you as an employer can do legally, so you figure that out, and then you figure out what you actually should do, what is right for your company, okay? And so the first thing we'll talk about is what you can do. And the first thing that most people ask me is, can I mandate the vaccine? And the answer to that is yes. So you as an employer can require that your employees get the vaccine. That's the general rule. And there are 2 exceptions to that, which you've probably heard, and that is if an employee has a medical reason relating to a disability, or they have a religious objection. And so we'll talk about that in more detail as we go through. But in general, the rule is you can mandate the vaccine for your employees. The second thing that you can do legally is you can encourage your employees to get the vaccine. So you can offer incentives, and we'll talk about some examples of that. And the third thing that you can legally do is you can ask employees about their vaccination status. So you can give out a form, you can ask your employees to fill it out, telling you whether they intend to get a vaccine, what the dates of their vaccine were, and you can ask for proof. So we'll go through all of that. So those are the main three things, the questions that I get of what you can do. And so we're going to talk about each one of those individually. So let's say the first thing you want to know is, how do I actually make it a rule? And so, as we said, generally speaking, you can require it unless the employee raises one of two objections. And one has to do with disability. And so if an employee comes to you and says they don't want to get a vaccine because they have a disability or a medical issue, the law that we're talking about is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so in order for an employee to successfully object, I guess, to getting a vaccine in accordance with the Americans Disabilities Act, is they show they have a disability, number one, which I'll just point out that's different from having just a medical issue. You can have a medical issue without it actually qualifying as a disability. And so for purposes of this statute, the employee has to show that they have a disability. And then they show that there's an actual relationship between the disability and the vaccine. And so, for example, an employee could say, I have a disability, I'm in a wheelchair. That doesn't mean that they can't get a vaccine, right? So there has to be a relationship. And so for that involves a doctor's note, a doctor's explanation as to why this disability means they can't get the vaccine. And then the employee is supposed to tell you what accommodation they want. And so in this scenario, the accommodation they want is probably to not get a vaccine, right? Or sometimes it's to more than that, not only not get a vaccine, but work from home. And so then when you have that information from the employee, now it's the employer's job to kind of evaluate that and decide, well, is that employee's not getting a vaccine something that we can handle? And so the thing that the employer has to show, if they say that's not enough, it's really important for everyone to have a vaccine, the employer has to show that that employee coming to work without a vaccine is a direct threat to the safety of not only the employee, but the employee's colleagues. And so that's going to be somewhat complicated. Keep in mind, there's no precedent for this yet. This is all brand new, right? And so it would probably, you'd have to show what percentage of your workforce is already vaccinated, because it'd be difficult for you to prove that this is going to be a safety threat for everyone at your office if everyone else is vaccinated, right? But that would be something to consider. If instead what the employee wants is to work from home, you could show that that is not something the employer can handle. That would be an undue hardship, as you can see from the slide. And so it's kind of, you may have heard of something called the interactive process. If an employee has a disability and they want an accommodation, in this case, working from home or not getting a vaccine, you have this interactive process, this conversation back and forth, where the employee says, this is my problem, this is how I think it can be fixed, and then the employer evaluates that and decides if they can actually accommodate the employee. The employer does not always have to accommodate them if the employer feels that it's a hardship to do so. Okay, so the second reason why an employee can object to getting a vaccine is if they have a religious objection. And that's a different law. That's Title VII. And so, whereas the Americans Disabilities Act has to do with discriminating against and accommodating people with disabilities, Title VII is a non-discrimination statute that applies to lots of different things, race and gender and age, but also religion. And so Title VII says that an employer has to provide a reasonable accommodation for an employee's religious beliefs, again, unless it would pose an undue hardship. And so this is, again, an interactive process where the employer says, everyone get a vaccine. And then the employee comes forward and says, I have a religious objection. I would like an accommodation. And the accommodation is for me to not get a vaccine. And then the employer says, well, that's going to be, I can't do that. That's too dangerous. Or if you're wanting to work from home, I can't handle that either. And one thing that makes this a little tricky is that you as the employer may doubt whether the employee actually has a legitimate religious objection. You may think that the employee just doesn't want a vaccine. So this can be a little bit awkward. And I can tell you again, there's no precedent for this yet. And so you can ask for documentation of the employee's religion and religious objection. And then you kind of just have to evaluate whether you think that that is a good faith religious objection or not. And then you as the employer can decide, well, can I handle this accommodation or not? Is it going to be okay for this one employee to come to work and not be vaccinated? Maybe. Or like I said before, if the employee's accommodation that they request is to work from home, can you accommodate that? Maybe, maybe not. That's something that you have to evaluate. All right, so the second thing that we were talking about, what an employer can do, and we were saying you can encourage it. And so some of the incentives that I've seen employers offer are things like gift cards, cash bonuses. All these are permitted, okay? I will say that a cash bonus and a gift card, you don't want those to be, not that they would probably from an employer's point of view, but you don't want them to be too significant, because then that'll make it seem as if the vaccine, boy, that vaccine must be super dangerous, right? Because they're offering me $1,000 to get one. You just want it to be like a little bit of an extra push in order to encourage your employees to get a vaccine. Wellness points are things like if you have a wellness program where employees can get points for not just getting a vaccine, a COVID vaccine, but getting a flu shot, or joining a gym, or quitting smoking. These are all common ways of earning wellness points with certain programs, and once you earn a certain number of points, you can get a cash bonus. So that's another thing that employers are doing. These are all just ideas for you to kind of think about and keep in mind as a way of getting people out the door and getting their vaccine. Paid leave is something that you can do. You can give paid leave to get a vaccine just out of the company's pocket. You can have employees use their paid leave, which they probably aren't going to want to do, or you can give paid leave under certain circumstances and get that back in the form of a tax credit, which some of you are probably familiar with, and we will talk about that in a lot more detail later on in the presentation. But this is just something to keep in mind. Paid leave is another incentive that you can give so people will get their vaccine. I have a couple of clients who have said they'll take everybody out to lunch if they'll get a vaccine. And if you can get everybody vaccinated, you can have everyone take off their masks. So that's kind of a huge incentive. I don't know of anyone who has successfully done that yet, but maybe soon. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, another very common question has to do with what information you can ask. And the answer to that is actually pretty simple. You can ask all about their vaccination status, right? It is not a HIPAA violation, and it is not an invasion of privacy. So you can, for example, one very common thing that for employers to do is to hand out a form to all your employees where you say, hey, this company really values vaccines. It's our policy to keep track of who's vaccinated and who's not. Please fill out this form and tell me what date were you vaccinated, shot 1 and shot 2. You can ask for a copy of their vaccination card. And then you can say, you know, if you're not vaccinated, do you intend to be vaccinated? Yes or no. Keep in mind that if you do not intend to make it a requirement to be vaccinated, there's no need to ask that follow-up question. So if they say, no, I'm not intending to get a vaccine, you don't need to say, why not, if you're not planning on mandating it. So for this, you're just keeping a record. This employee is planning on getting vaccinated, this employee is not. And the reason why this is allowed and why this actually makes good sense is because if you have a list of all your employees who are vaccinated and who are not, then if you have an employee at your place of business who is someday in the future COVID positive, the vaccination status of your workforce will impact who quarantines and who doesn't quarantine, and whether you shut down or whether a division of your company has to all go home. Because once you're vaccinated, you don't quarantine. Okay, so it's actually, when we're talking about what you can do and what you should do, I actually recommend that employers keep track of who's vaccinated, because that really does impact how you're going to conduct business going forward. And so this next slide is saying, now that you know these are the things that you can legally do. It doesn't mean you have to do any of them, but now that you know that that's what you can do, now think about that. What do you think is best for your company? Should you keep track of everyone? What incentives do you want to give? And do you want to mandate it? And when you're thinking about whether you want to mandate it, of course, you'll have to think about how available it is. And, you know, a couple months ago, it wasn't available to everyone. It depended on age. And so it didn't really make sense to mandate it then, because only people over 65 could get it. Now that everyone can get it over age 16, that makes more sense. And to be honest, I actually don't know everyone that I interact with. I'm happy to say is either has an appointment to get a vaccine or is already vaccinated. And so I don't have a good sense of whether it's still really difficult to get an appointment. But that's just something to keep in mind. If you're going to mandate it, you know, you can just kind of keep the lines of communication open. Is anyone having trouble getting an appointment? Can I help anyone get an appointment? Because there are a lot of different ways to get an appointment. So keep that in mind. You don't want to obviously punish someone for not getting a vaccine when they tried to get one and they just can't get it yet. Okay. So the second topic is masks. And so keep in mind that there are two different government authorities that govern mask wearing. One of them is the CDC, and the other is the state of Connecticut. So the CDC has guidelines, and the guidelines are just that. They're not the law, and so you won't be punished for not following them, but they're recommended for the safety of your workforce. The state of Connecticut has mandates. You will be punished if you don't follow the mandates, so just keep that in mind. So first, we're just going to do the guidelines, because this, even though they're not required, these are recommended. And so hopefully your interest is the safety of your workforce, and so you'll follow these. I recommend that you follow these guidelines. So for masks, the CDC is saying that masks should still be worn in public. By the way, we're talking about unvaccinated people at this point, okay? Masks should be worn in public. You should still stay 6 feet apart from everyone else. And wear masks when you're around people who don't live in your household. So in other words, you're at work, okay? So you're wearing masks. Also, just so you know, the CDC recommends that you wear a mask inside your home if someone you live with has symptoms. That should kind of be obvious. And masks may not be necessary when you're outside. Again, we're unvaccinated at this point. Outside, by yourself, away from others, or with people who do live in your household. Okay, so those are the general guidelines for masks for unvaccinated people. The exception to that is a person who has a disability who can't wear a mask. That, I think everyone understands that. So now the CDC, you may have heard on the news, has been modifying the mask requirement if you are vaccinated. And so you want to wear a mask still, stay 6 feet apart, and avoid crowds and the poorly ventilated spaces in 3 scenarios. At work, but keep in mind what we're going to say down below. When you're gathering with unvaccinated people from more than one other household, so that's also usually at work, and when you're visiting with an unvaccinated person who's at risk. Okay, so even when you're vaccinated, these are the scenarios when you wear a mask. You don't have to wear a mask anymore if you're indoors with other fully vaccinated people. And so as we said in that prior slide, if you're at work and everyone is fully vaccinated and you're even though you're inside, you can take off your masks. That's if you're not interacting with anyone else, any member of the public, and everyone inside is vaccinated, you can take off your mask. And then you may have heard, let's see if we can get to the outdoor part. If you're outdoors, you can take off your mask if you're vaccinated. And you can gather indoors with unvaccinated people if they're only from one other household. So I suppose if you're at work and your company is small enough so that you're vaccinated, but there's only one other person from a different household and they're unvaccinated, you can take off your mask. Okay, so kind of just the general rule is when you're dealing with the work site, everyone should still be trying to stay 6 feet apart. You wear a mask and you keep it on until everyone is vaccinated, unfortunately. And that is an incentive for people to get vaccinated, for everyone to take off their masks. So I have this website up here because if you're following the news, you know that these rules are constantly changing. So that's the CDC website there with the rules about mask wearing and a bunch of other things related to COVID as well. And so really, I recommend you just check it every week. Every Monday, you get to work, check this website and see if anything has changed. All right, so we were talking about the guidelines that I recommend you follow for the safety of your workforce, right? But when we're talking about the actual mandates, the things you could, in theory, get in trouble for, right? That's where the state of Connecticut comes in. And so the state of Connecticut is saying for unvaccinated people, masks need to be worn in public settings. So that means at work, where social distancing is not possible. So if you're at work and everybody can stay 6 feet apart from everyone else at all times, you can take off your masks, okay? That's indoors or outdoors. If you're vaccinated, masks are not required outdoors in small groups. That's the state of Connecticut following the CDC rule. Okay, and so I have a website here for the state of Connecticut as well. State of Connecticut is also constantly changing for good. The rules are becoming more and more relaxed. And so this website here is for the state of Connecticut having to do with COVID back to work rules. So that's the website for that. All right, and so the next general topic to cover is just what do you do, what happens when people actually return to the work site? You say, let's say people are vaccinated, they've got their masks on, it's time for everyone to come back to work, right? So the main thing to keep in mind is that employers can require their employees to come back. That's the general rule. So you can say to everyone, hey everyone, it's time to come back. It's time to open up and come back to work. again, this is kind of like something to keep in mind. This is what you can do legally. And so then now that you know that, you kind of have to sit and think about, what do we want to do? Do we want to do that? And is that best for our company? But before we get to that, let's just talk about, again, we have an exception to the general rule that you can require everyone to come back to work. The exception to that is if a person has a disability. And so similar to the issue having to do with the vaccine, if you have an employee who doesn't want to come back to work in person, it's really, legally speaking, it's not enough for that employee to say, I'm against vaccines. And it's not enough for the employee to say, I'm just super nervous. I haven't been back in so long, I'm just nervous to come back. If we're talking about just legally, whether you can say, I'm sorry, that's not enough, come back, those two reasons are not enough for those people to stay home against your wishes as the employer. But if an employee says, I have a disability and the disability prevents me from coming back to work on site, but I can still work for you with an accommodation, and the accommodation is that I work from home, then your job as the employer, again, is to, first of all, evaluate whether they have a disability. And so that's going to be a doctor's note explaining the disability and why the disability prevents them from coming back to work. And then you evaluate whether it's an undue hardship for you to accommodate them as they've requested. And so if they're requesting to not come in person and to work from home, you have to evaluate whether that working from home is something that you can continue to handle. And so the reason why I gave this example as a CAD drafter, that was kind of just a reminder for me, because I had an employer ask this question just yesterday, and I thought it was a good example of how this comes up. And so this particular employer has an employee who is fully vaccinated. She has diabetes, and the employer was having that employee work remotely for the past year, even though the employee typically would go on site to customer places of business to take measurements. Because business was down so much in this prior year, it was doable for them to have this employee work from home. But just recently, the employer is bringing everyone back. And so this employee with diabetes submitted a doctor's note saying, I have diabetes, and that diabetes makes it risky for me to get COVID. Even though I'm vaccinated, this is what her doctor said. And so the doctor said, she can go to work 2 days a week. Not all 5. 5 is too dangerous, but she can come in 2 days a week and work from home the other 3. And so this is where, as an employer, you kind of have to evaluate this and figure out, am I going to accept that? I don't feel like fighting over it. That's fine, whatever. Or are you going to kind of really think about whether this is going to work for you? And in my mind, there are a couple of issues there for them to think about. One was, although sometimes it can be tough to challenge a doctor, because you guys aren't doctors, right? It seems a little strange to me that the doctor would say, okay, this is a fully vaccinated person. It's too risky for her to be exposed to the public 5 days a week, but it's an okay risk for her to be exposed to the public 2 days a week. I think I would want a little more information about that. Like, why, if it's so dangerous for this employee she was taking public transportation, as it turns out. If it's so dangerous for this employee to get on a bus, because despite her having a vaccine, she might still get it, why was that okay for her to do that twice a week? So we had some questions about that. But also now it turns out that now this business is really super busy. And so they need this particular person to not only do the CAD drafting from home, but they need this person to go on site and take measurements, because now they're busy again. And so when they're evaluating this request for an accommodation and the accommodation is to work from home, that's an undue hardship for this employer. They need this person to go on site. And so in this type of situation, it is okay for the employer to say, that's an accommodation that we can't do. You could do a different job for a different amount of pay, but we need someone to go on site, so we can't do that. So that's just kind of an example of how this may play out. So then the question comes up, so now that you know you can tell people that they all need to come back to work, just like when we were talking about the vaccine, the next question is, all right, I can do that. Should I do that? Should I have everyone come back to work? And this is very individual. This will be different for each of you. Each company will have different things to consider, right? So some things to keep in mind is that you're probably not going to have everyone be vaccinated, at least not for a while. So having some people stay from work from home if they can, generally speaking, will still be safer because the lower building capacity you have, the safer your building arguably is. Flexible work schedules may improve your employee morale. Inflexible work arrangements may end up with high turnover because we're finding that this whole pre-COVID workplace where everyone just comes in person and the general rule is that everyone works from the office, that's getting to be less common. And so as more and more employees see that other employees are offering flexible work arrangements, it's just something to keep in mind. You may find that employees go elsewhere if they can't have a flexible work arrangement. Another thing to keep in mind is just practical things like what percentage of your workforce is vaccinated. If 90% is vaccinated, it may make perfect sense for everybody to come back in person. But if you're one of those companies where you're kind of having trouble with getting your people vaccinated and 20% have the vaccine, you may just as soon have a fair number of those people work remotely still. And you'll consider how closely people work together, how tight a space it is, whether they can actually effectively work from home, because I don't think you should presume that just because, hey, everything's getting better, everyone can come back. If you've got people who can effectively actually do their job from home, that's perfectly fine to have people continue to work from home. And of course, in the future, maybe not right away, you can think about whether having some people work from home and some people come in is actually going to save you money in the long run. So by showing you this list, I don't want to give you the impression that I have any opinion on whether you should allow people to have flexible work arrangements and have some people work remotely. These are just because I have no opinion on that. That's going to, like I said, it's very individual for each of you. It's going to differ depending on the company. But these are some things to keep in mind when you're thinking about, well, I can bring everyone back, but should I bring everyone back? And here at CBIA, we are finding that although a lot of employers are really eager to have people come back, it actually is very common for business owners to say, you know what, we're gonna do things a little differently now. There's no need for everyone to be here all the time. And so in a recent survey that we wrote about, 82% of CEOs reported that they actually are going to have part of their workforce work from home, even if people are all vaccinated, that it's turned out that it's not necessary to have everyone come in person. So that is only something to keep in mind, just to, I guess, have an open mind about that. And so before we change this topic, I just thought I would point out, you may have seen Governor Lamont at a press conference, I think it was last week, where he announced 2 changes to Connecticut return to work issues. One of them takes effect day after tomorrow, and it has to do with the restaurants. Curfew used to be 11 o'clock at night, now it's midnight. Bars that don't serve food can now reopen, but only outdoors. And the 8-person per table limit is no longer a thing as long as you're outdoors. Those are the only remaining restrictions as of May 1st. And then on May 19th, in the state of Connecticut, as far as Governor Lamont is concerned, the restrictions for business are done, with the exception of masks. So beginning on May 19th, it's kind of like, it's almost like we're back to normal. There aren't any restrictions, there aren't rules, it's 100% capacity, everything's back to normal. There are, as this slide notes, some DPH recommendations for big events. And so you can go to the DPH website to find out what those are. Those will be constantly changing and becoming more relaxed as we go through the summer. All right, so the next topic is quarantining. And there are kind of two general subparts to quarantining, like why people might be quarantining still today. And that has to do with people getting sick at work or at home and so can't come to work. And then also people who might need to quarantine because they're traveling. So we're going to talk about those two things. So if you have someone, this is a really common question. If you have someone at work who tests positive, what should you do? And generally speaking, you don't have to shut down, especially now with people being vaccinated. What you do want to do, though, is you want to, if possible, shut down the area of your physical plant where the COVID positive person was working. And if possible, this may not be possible, but if possible, wait a period of time. CDC recommends 24 hours before you clean it. And that's simply for the safety of the person who's doing the cleaning. Okay, so you wait, then you clean. You tell the other employees who may have been exposed that they've been exposed. And technically you want to try and maintain the confidentiality of the person who's positive, but that person's not going to come into work the next day, so people are going to know who's positive, and there's nothing you can do about that. So you don't have to worry about that. What you want to say is you may have been exposed to someone, and so I need you to do the following things, which we're going to talk about. So the person who tests positive stays home, hopefully, obviously. And you want that person to stay home for 10 days from the point of the positive test or from the point that symptoms started. You do not require the employee to give you a negative test result in order to come back, because that employee, once they've tested positive, they will continue to test positive for many weeks afterwards, even though they're not at risk of spreading it. And so before they return, they're going to wait 10 days and wait 24 hours since the time that they've had a fever. If they still need medicine to make their fever go down, you don't start counting the 24 hours yet. It's got to be without medicine, and all other symptoms have to have improved. Now, while this person is home for 10 days, you can give them sick pay, which is something we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So then the people that have been exposed, and by exposed, we mean coming within 6 feet of someone else, those people also stay home. Now, in theory, your employees should not be within 6 feet of each other, right? In theory. So if you can say for sure that everyone at the workplace has been 6 feet apart from everyone else, no one is exposed. And so no one except for the COVID positive person has to stay home. But you can't always stay 6 feet apart from everyone else. And so for those people who have come within 6 feet of the person who's positive, those people also stay home. And so these people, even if they have no symptoms, CDC recommends that they stay home for 14 days. And so you may notice that's even longer than the person who tested positive. And that's because if you've been exposed, remember, you may not test positive or be contagious with others for another couple of days from the time that you were exposed. So if you were exposed on day 1, you stay home for 14 days from the day of exposure. Now there is the CDC, if you go to the CDC website, on this slide you can see that website there. That will explain an alternative way where you don't have to stay home the entire 14 days. It's a little bit complicated, so I just put the website there. It has to do with serial testing. So you stay home for a certain amount, you take a COVID test, you stay home a little bit longer, you take another COVID test, because one test, because you can't always predict exactly when you're going to test positive, you have to take more than one test if you're going to come in sooner than 14 days. Okay. So the other reason why people may be quarantining is because they've been traveling. Now, these rules have changed recently, having to do with vaccinations and having to do with the difference between, again, the CDC and the state of Connecticut. In the state of Connecticut, you may remember, this was before March 19th, there were travel restrictions. And so if you were entering Connecticut from another state or from another country, you had to fill out a form. When you got back to the state, you had to quarantine for a certain amount of time, and you weren't supposed to go back into public or go back to work for a certain amount of time. And if you violated that, you would actually be fined. So as of March 19th, the state of Connecticut has no more travel restrictions. So what that means is not that you shouldn't quarantine, because we're going to get to that next. It just means that there are no laws requiring you to quarantine, okay? And you won't be fined for not quarantining in the state of Connecticut. So now the difference there is that, remember, there are the two different agencies. You've got the state of Connecticut and the CDC. And so the CDC does have quarantining recommendations that differ. There's 4 groups, and that's in these next 4 slides. It depends on whether you're traveling domestically or internationally, and it depends on whether you've been vaccinated. So this first slide, and this is these are a lot of words to have on a PowerPoint slide, but the idea is that you can just print these out and kind of refer to them. Hopefully they'll still be in effect for at least the next several months. So if you've got an employee who travels domestically and he's fully vaccinated, there is no need to quarantine and there's no need to get a COVID test. And so the reason why that's relevant for you as the employer is because what we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes is sick leave and whether you get a tax credit for giving people sick leave. If you've got an employee who's fully vaccinated, who goes to Florida and back, that person does not need to quarantine. And so if you give him sick leave to quarantine, you won't get that money back as a tax credit because it's just not necessary. Then we've got domestic travel for unvaccinated persons. I won't go through all this in detail, but you can see the recommendations are to get a test before you go so that you don't spread it to everyone. And there's recommendations about getting tests when you come home and quarantining when you come home. This would be a scenario where it's kind of ironic. It's where your unvaccinated employees would be entitled to paid, well, not entitled. If you gave paid sick leave to this unvaccinated employee, because there's this recommendation that they quarantine, you'll get that sick pay back in the form of a tax credit, which we're talking about next. And so then this next slide just shows you the rules for international travel. For fully vaccinated people, there's no need to quarantine, but you won't be allowed back in the country, just so you know, or your employee won't be allowed back in the country unless they have with them a negative COVID test. So that employee would get the test in the foreign country, have it in their hand, and they have to have it with them in order to get on the plane to come back in the country. Because the person is fully vaccinated, though, they do not have to quarantine, and you would not be giving them sick pay if you wanted a tax credit for that sick pay. And then this final slide on travel restrictions talks about kind of the worst scenario of the four: international travel for unvaccinated people, testing, quarantining, monitoring for symptoms, the whole thing, okay? And so the reason, like I said, the reason why we're even talking about that, it's not just so that you know where to go on vacation, but as the employer, you've got people who are going to want sick pay, either because they're sick or because they're following a recommendation to quarantine. And so you can give that sick pay and get all the wages back, all the benefits that you gave, you will get back dollar for dollar in the form of a tax credit if you follow certain rules, which we're going to talk about. So hopefully most of you are familiar with this FFCRA, the Family's First Coronavirus Response Act, because it used to be mandatory. And I just wanted to give you kind of a general sense of what the law used to be, because I think a lot of you are familiar with that. I'll give you a sense of what the law is now and how it's different. So last year, between April and December, it was mandatory for employers to give paid sick leave to their employees, 80 hours worth of pay if they were sick, and 12 weeks of family and medical leave at a reduced rate if the reason they were staying home is because their kid's school was closed due to COVID. That law expired on December 31st of 2020. You no longer have to give that sick pay or that family and medical leave pay. But you'll see from this slide, you may remember that the deadline was extended to March at first, which meant that you could use that same bucket of time. Like if an employee hadn't used all 80 hours, he had until now March to use those hours. You could still give the sick pay and get the tax credit. And now what we're talking about is the American Rescue Plan Act. That's what President Biden signed, also known as the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. And so what that statute says is that, again, you can, if you wish, as the employer, you can voluntarily give paid sick leave to employees under certain circumstances, and you'll get that back in the form of a tax credit. You don't have to provide this sick leave, but you can. And so the incentive is that you'll get the tax credit. And so since we're coming up towards the end, I'll just kind of list these for you. The 80, so you get, as of April 1st, this is this new American Rescue Plan. The thing that makes it a little different is that now your employees get a brand new bucket of time, brand new 80 hours, and a brand new set of 12 weeks. And the reasons why you can get the paid sick leave there are more of them. And so you can see, you can get this employee can get 80 hours of 100% pay for the old reasons, like being subject to a quarantine or having COVID symptoms, but also to get a vaccine, to recover from side effects from a vaccine, or because they're waiting for test results. Like, let's say you as the employer ask someone to get a test result because you think they've been exposed, so you want them to stay home. You can give them the sick leave. They'll get 100% pay for the 2 weeks, and you'll get that money back because you're following the rules. You'll get it back in the form of a tax credit. If the employee is simply taking care of someone else, they get 2/3 pay, 80 hours at 2/3 pay. And then the significant change to the way it's working now is that you remember the employees could get 12 weeks of FMLA time if their kid was home because the school was closed. That's still a thing. But now the employees can also get the 12 weeks for any of the other reasons. And so what that means is that the employees can get 2 weeks at full 100% pay, 80 hours, 2 weeks, plus an additional 12 weeks for any of the same reasons. And so the way that's going to come up is that a couple things. First of all, you may have employees who are long haulers, which means that they have long-term sickness from having COVID. And so they'll get 80 hours at full pay, and then as much as an additional 12 weeks to deal with their symptoms. It will also come up if you've got an employee, let's say an employee took 80 hours because they were sick, and then a month later they were exposed and they need to stay home again. This is a way for them to stay home. This would fall under the 12-week part because they already took their 80 hours, and they'll get paid at the 2/3 rate. This is all, I'd like to just emphasize again, this is all voluntary on your part, but if you would, like, the incentive is to keep everyone healthy, don't spread it around the workplace, you can give them their pay and you'll get the tax credit back. And so I'm going to skip this one just for a second and just talk to you briefly about the tax credits. When you add up the 80 hours plus the 12 weeks, you can get as much as $17,000 back in the form of a tax credit per employee, and that's just the wages. So you can claim the wages. You can also claim the health plan expenses that are allocable to those wages. So that means the cost of the group health insurance premium for that employee, you claim that. And all these are things that you claim against your share of the Medicare taxes, your quarterly taxes. And so if it turns out that the wages you paid in sick time are more than your tax liability, you still get the money back. You're going to get a refund in that case. And so dollar for dollar, the wages that you pay in sick time and the health benefits that you give these sick employees, you'll get back in the form of the tax credit. There's a note here not to discriminate against people. Obviously, you won't get the tax credit if you treat the usual groups better than the other, if you discriminate based on race or whatever. But also, if you discriminate in favor of highly compensated employees or full-time employees, you also won't get the tax credit. And so I just went back to a prior slide. These are the most common questions I get for the tax credits, which are, can you give since it's voluntary, can you just give the 80 hours for the sick time and not the 12 weeks? And the answer to that is probably yes. The reason we don't know for sure is because the Labor Department was supposed to issue guidance on that, and they haven't yet. But what most practitioners agree, that because this is a voluntary way of giving benefits, that you can choose how to give them as long as you don't discriminate. So you can say, here's the second question, can you provide just a portion of it? Yes. And so one way you could do that is you could say, hey, you would want to do this uniformly, right? So you decide what your rule is going to be, you publish it to your workforce, and you do it across the board. So maybe what you would want to say is, hey, everybody at this company, we're going to give paid sick leave for everybody who gets a vaccine, for everybody who needs to stay home sick the next day after their vaccine, and for everybody who has to get a COVID test. That's what we're doing. That's how we're using this. And you're thinking to yourself, as the employer, you're going to keep track of all that, and you'll claim that on your Medicare taxes, and you'll get all those benefits back. The rest of the paid sick leave you don't have to do, but you don't want to do it. You don't want to give it to one employee and not another, obviously. Same thing with the family leave. You could say, we're going to do this as long as we can stand it. And then at a certain point say, we can't do it. Maybe when schools close, you'll say, we're done with that now. We're going to do it until that point. You do it the same for all employees across the board. You claim your tax credit as long as you follow the rules up until that point. And then one just question about how this interacts with regular FMLA. If you're an employer who is large enough that you offer FMLA, you don't need to worry. This family and medical leave is not on top of regular FMLA. So you're not, where if you were giving 12 weeks before, you're not now giving 24. This is just another reason why someone might go out on FMLA leave. And so just like with the birth of a child, they might go out. Now they're going to go out because they're either sick with COVID or the kid's school is closed or any of those reasons. I would just point out, be careful, the eligibility is different. So you can get this COVID type of FMLA by just being employed for 30 days. Whereas I'm sure for those of you who are using regular FMLA, you have to be employed for a year. So there are different eligibility requirements. So I think we're really close to the end. If there's just a question or two, let me know and I will answer those.
Hi, Diane. We do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Does paid sick leave apply to part-time employees?
It does. And so when you're trying to figure out how much to give, it's the average number of hours that the person works in a 2-week period. So you wouldn't give the 80 hours. You would just give how many hours they would typically work in a 2-week period. Those are the hours they would get at the 100% pay rate.
Thank you. Just to clarify, if 35 employees get vaccinated and 3 choose not to, everyone still has to wear a mask at the office when within 6 feet of others, or just when they're around those people who choose not to be vaccinated?
The employees who will interact with or be in the vicinity of the people who are unvaccinated, sounds like a punishment, but it's really not meant to be that. It's just for safety. The people who are around the people who are unvaccinated, all those people wear masks. The unvaccinated and the vaccinated all wear masks. If there's like a whole separate area of the company and it's filled with vaccinated people, they can take their masks off.
Okay. When an employee tests positive, if a fully vaccinated employee was near the infected employee, does that vaccinated employee also need to quarantine?
No, and that's why it makes sense to keep track of who's vaccinated. Because if you have someone who tests positive at work and the only people he interacted with are vaccinated people, nobody quarantines. You just send the sick person home and business goes on as usual.
Thank you.
So it's a big incentive to keep track.
And we have one last question. How would you suggest we word the inquiry form that we give to employees regarding vaccination intentions?
I think that it would just be a series of maybe 3, I'm trying to think ahead, 3 questions. You could say at the top, just in general, Company X values the safety of our workforce and we'd like to encourage everyone to get a vaccine. Please, we'd like to keep track of the vaccination status of our workforce so that we can keep track of quarantining requirements. And so please, you hand this out or email it to everyone. And you say, please answer the following questions. Question number 1, please fill out the date. If you've received a vaccine, please fill out the dates that you received shot 1, shot 2. Okay, question 2. If you have not been vaccinated yet, do you plan on getting a vaccine? Do you have an appointment? What is the date? Fill that out. And then the last question is, if you're not already vaccinated, or if they answered no to you plan to getting a vaccine, you just keep track of the no answer, put it in your file. And so then you know if that no person, if they filled out no dates and they say, nope, I'm not planning to get a vaccine, that person has to quarantine if there's an infection at the office and they were exposed.
Thank you.
There's no like magic form. It's really just however, there's no like legally required form. All you're trying to do is figure out which of you people, who's vaccinated and who's not, and when are we going to be done. That's why you asked for the dates. And if you don't want to ask for the dates, you can just say, hey, can you give me a copy of your card? And then you keep track on what date will everyone be done.
Perfect. Thank you. That's the last question that we had.
Okay, great. Well, so then that's it. Thank you everyone for listening. There are answers to a lot of these questions also on the CBIA website, cbia.com. And also, if any of you out there are CBIA members, you can call me or call the hotline and get answers to these questions too. But other than that, I really appreciate the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
All right, yeah, thank you, Diane. I think everybody who joined today learned a lot, and you covered a lot of bases that I think a lot of people had questions on. So if you have joined and you couldn't catch the whole presentation, we are going to have a taping of it on our BBB Serving Connecticut YouTube channel. So you can go there later today, and it's also going to be in your wrap-up email as well. Also, just housekeeping, if you want Diane's presentation, it is in your handouts tab, so you can download it. And again, thank you, Diane, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. See ya.
Bye.